So I've just mentioned Tycho, and his observations were used to show that the Earth orbits the Sun. It's perhaps less well known that his sister, Sophia Brahe, worked with him and was there during most of this time, including when he observed a supernova for the first time in 1572 and a lunar eclipse the following year. Sophia was just 14 at that point. Other young astronomers include Elizabetha Kubrin-Hibbelicus. She was married to a 52-year-old man when she was 16. Jean de May became an astronomer at 17 after becoming a widow. She wrote Discourse on the Opinion of Copernicus when she was 20 years old, which proved that the Sun can't be orbiting the Earth. However, unfortunately, this wasn't taken as examples of how women can very obviously do science. And distinguished scientists and astronomers still had to correspond using pseudonyms, including quite often their husband's name. This included Maria Cunex, despite the fact that she published a book in her own name where she made one of the first descriptions of the scientific method. In a biography published 50 years after her death, she was described as so deeply engaged in astronomical speculation that she neglected her household. Yeah. This view was echoed by MIT in 1906, and they said they couldn't employ married women because the college cannot afford to have women on staff for whom the college work is secondary. But it's not willing to approve women who put the housework secondary as well, so, it's as if you can't win. Around the same time, the French astronomer Marguerite de Vossolet was mocked for observing Jupiter, saying it would ruin her complexion. So all of this sort of implies that you can't be considered both a good woman and a good scientist. There are some exceptions, thank goodness. Sophia Germain was a French mathematician. She corresponded with another French mathematician called Carl Gauss under a pseudonym. And when she disclosed her identity to him in 1807, he replied, "When a woman, because of her sex, our customs and prejudices, encounters infinitely more obstacles than men in familiarizing herself with this sort of mathematics, yet overcomes this, and penetrates that which is most hidden, she doubtless has the most noble courage, extraordinary talent, and superior genius." And of course, as always, women did continue to explore the universe. Maria Emaart, for example, made hundreds of astronomical illustrations in the 1690s. Celia Barogromio discovered a type of mathematics that allows you to draw shapes on rotating spheres, which is obviously very important for astronomy. Guan Lu devised an early type of camera, thermometer, a telescope in 1790. And again, there are lots and lots of other examples. Now, science became better defined in the 19th century. So the term scientist was used for the first time in the 1830s, and it became a profession in its own right by the end of the century. So part of doing this was separating amateur and professional astronomers, unfortunately, and the motivation for this was that there were religious restrictions on what could be taught and researched. So schools, universities, and places like the Royal Society could only pursue knowledge that was in line with the Bible. So at the same time, there was a group of scientists who called themselves the Young Guard, and they were trying to change this. And they were quite influential. They were part of the Royal Society, they helped found the journal Nature, and they formed what they called the Eggs Club, where they used to leave for dinner and discuss evolution and science. And it was here that Huxley coined the term agnostic. And I think this is because atheism was illegal at the time. So they were fairly successful, and religious texts were removed from science lessons in the UK in the 1870s. And amateur astronomers, who they considered to be mainly funded by the church, were slowly removed from these sort of institutions. There are some issues with this. One of them that I'm going to focus on is women are more likely at this point to be amateur astronomers because they're certainly not going to be paid at this point. So this meant that this group of powerful men who aimed to rid themselves of what they considered to be superstition and pseudoscience managed to keep those that benefited them, funnily enough. And they continued to show the same level of prejudice against women. At the same time, science began to branch into more specialised subjects, so they formed sort of separate societies of their own at that point, including the Chemical Society and the Geological Society, and there's quite a few around the path as you come in. The Astronomical Society, where we are today, was founded in 1820 by 14 gentlemen in a tavern. The astronomer William Herschel, who's famous for discovering the first planet with a telescope, became the first president. His sister, Caroline Herschel, is less well known, but she is just as important an astronomer. She discovered an asteroid, 5 comets, a new galaxy, and made numerous star and nebula catalogues. Now, in 1828, the Astronomical Society decided to award them a gold medal, and this is their highest honour. At the meeting, they said the labours of Miss Herschel are so intimately connected with those of her brother that an investigation of the latter is absolutely necessary. But when we've done this, an important part remains untold. It was Miss Herschel who planned the labour of every succeeding night. It was Miss Herschel who arranged everything in systematic order, who made every observation and every calculation, and it was Caroline Herschel that helped William Herschel achieve his impenetrable name. So this all sounds pretty good, like this might be a step in the right direction. However, the Royal Astronomical Society received its Royal Charter in 1831. Fellows were referred to as he. And so Caroline Herschel and another astronomer, Mary Somerville, were instead made honorary members in 1835. At the meeting it says, your council has no small pleasure in recommending that the names of 2 ladies distinguished in different walks of astronomy be placed on the list of honorary members. There can be but one voice, and your council is of the opinion that time has gone by when either feeling or prejudice should be allowed to interfere with the payment of a well-earned tribute of respect. So, again, you might think this is good. However, 50 years later, Isis Pogson was nominated to be a fellow for the first time. One man reported that unless it could be shown that women could not consistently exercise the rights and perform the duties of a fellow, the council could be compelled to put the name of a woman on for election. But when a second opinion was called for, it was to the effect that when the charter was granted, female fellows were not likely to have been in contemplation. And as the masculine pronoun is used throughout, they must be taken as not included. So after this, Potter's name was withdrawn from consideration. 6 years later, 3 other women were nominated to become fellows and were denied for exactly the same reason. This is Elizabeth Brown, Alice Everett, and Annie Munda. So Elizabeth Brown was a solar astronomer and one of the co-founders of the BAA, the British Astronomical Association. So this is a new amateur astronomy group where women were allowed to become members right from the beginning. Alice Everett was one of the first women to be paid for her astronomical work. So she worked as a computer at Greenwich Observatory. At the time, this meant she was literally a person that computed things. Annie Munda co-discovered the Munda minimum. So this is a period of time in the 1700s where there were less sunspots. And this coincided with what we call the Little Ice Age in Europe, and it was that period of time when the Thames used to freeze over. When they were denied, one fellow said, it was practically a proposal to introduce into these dull meetings a social element. And all we shall require is a piano and a fiddle, and I'm sure many of my young friends would be glad to dance through most of the papers. Now, unfortunately, that was a pretty common view. So, while women began to work as computers at Greenwich Observatory, in America, women began to work as computers at Harvard. So, Edward Pickering was the director at the time in the late 19th century. He began to hire women, such as Annie Whitlock, Wilhelmina Fleming, Annie John Cannon, and Henrietta Swan Leavitt, both of whom were deaf, also Antonia Murray, who I'll mention a bit later. Now, some suggest that Pickering was progressive for hiring women at the time. However, I think it is worth pointing out that he only had to pay them half of what he would have paid a man. So, Swan Leavitt, she discovered a type of variable star, and these variable stars get brighter and dimmer and brighter and dimmer. But they're otherwise pretty much identical, so you could use them to measure the distance of things. So if you measure them at their maximum brightness, the brighter thing is going to be closer. That makes sense. However, she couldn't do anything with this information because women weren't allowed to use high caliber telescopes until the 1960s. discovered this in 1908, she verified it in 1912, and then in 1925, Hubble used this information to measure the distance of things in the Milky Way. And he discovered, using this information, that the Andromeda Galaxy is a separate galaxy to the Milky Way. In 1929, he used this information to show that the universe is expanding, and is hence known as the person that proved the Big Bang Theory. Annie Judd Cannon, she became a computer at Harvard in 1896. She categorized over 200,000 stars, more than anybody else. She discovered 300 variable stars, 5 novae. She also developed what's known as the Harvard classification scheme, and this is something we still use today to distinguish types of stars, to classify stars. She did this by combining the work of Antonio Maury and Wilhelmina Fleming. So Fleming co-discovered the Horsehead Nebula, by the way, although she wasn't credited at the time, obviously. So Fleming became an honorary member of the Royal Astronomical Society in 1906 and Cannon in 1914. I'm just going to briefly mention a few other women that were very important at the time. Obviously, there's way too many to mention, and that's what my Twitter account's for. But Ada Lovelace is very important today, I think, to mention. She was considered to be the world's first computer scientist. She developed the concept of software in 1842. She developed a system which would have worked if she'd been able to implement it. Another is Maria Mitchell. She set up a school to teach girls mathematics when she was 17 years old, and went on to become the first professor of astronomy in America. Margaret Huggins pioneered the field of spectroscopy, which tells us what stars are made of. She was also a co-founder of the BEAA, as was Agnes Gabern, who made some wonderful textbooks, which I think are really beautifully illustrated, so I brought one here. Right, so women gained more rights, a few more rights, in the 20th century, particularly after the first two world wars.